Welcome. We're going to talk about Jesus' ministry, but we're going to have to start with the stories of his nativity or his birth. There are two of the four Gospels that tell the story of his life that feature the nativity. The other two don't. Matthew and Luke have birth stories. Mark just begins right at the beginning of his ministry, as does John, with a little bit of a cosmic prelude. But in Matthew and Luke, the stories that they tell, there are certain things that they agree upon. And then there are some certain different events that are featured in each of them, but not in the others. So I'm going to start here. First of all, let me put myself in the corner here and get out of the way. Alrighty. Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea somewhere between 8 and 5 BCE. Now, you remember that when we were talking about the switch from BC to AD, changing that to BCE to CE, I mentioned that this year that was supposed to be the time change was the year that Jesus was born, supposedly, but that the originators of the calendar had gotten it wrong by a few years. And by the time I get into talking about the differences between Matthew and Luke, you'll understand how we know that it falls in this period. So let's start with what they agree upon. They both agree that Jesus is born of a virgin. That is, his mother, when she gives birth to him, has never had sex with a man. Her name is Mary, and God is the father. This is a supernatural conception. And Mary, her husband Joseph, of course, is the assumed father by everyone that knows the family, I'm sure. And but Joseph does know that he is not the father. Of course, he's never had sex with Mary before she ends up pregnant. Of course, when he finds out that she's pregnant, is not real happy about this and is planning to end their engagement in a private enough way that Mary is not humiliated. He's a good man. He doesn't want to humiliate her. He is told in the Gospel of Matthew by an angel of the Lord that what has happened to Mary is a miracle of God, and he should not be afraid to marry her, and so he does. So both of the Gospels agree on this, though Matthew tells the story of the angel appearing to Joseph and telling him not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife. In the Gospel of Luke, there's an angel named Gabriel that appears to Mary and tells her what's going to happen to her, and Mary is willing to fulfill this purpose of God. The second thing they both agree on is that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. He's actually a descendant of great King David, both by his mother and by his father. Now, Matthew gives reportedly the genealogy of his father and Luke of his mother, so they kind of start the same place with King David, but by the time they get closer to Jesus, they diversify. They also both agree that Jesus is born in a town called Bethlehem, which is called the city of David because it was the city where David came from and where David's descendants, that's their main hometown, if you will. But Jesus' family lives much farther north in the Galilee, in a town called Nazareth, and that is where he is raised, which is strange. Both the Gospels agree on this, Matthew and Luke. What do they disagree upon? Well, let me tell you the story first, according to Matthew, and then I'll tell you the story according to Luke. According to Matthew, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem, and apparently they have a house there. When Mary, before she is married to Joseph, she's engaged, and she is found to be pregnant, the angel of the Lord comes to Joseph in a dream and tells him not to be afraid to marry Mary. And when she gives birth to the child, some interesting things happen. First of all, there are, it says, 3 magi, or wise men, from the east that come to Judah, or Judea, I should say. The Greek version of the word now is what we're using. And by the way, there's an old hymn that goes, "We 3 kings of Orient are." I'm not sure where the kings come from, because magi does not mean king. It obviously is the root of magic or magician. And what it's referring to is referring to astrologers / astronomers. Back then, there's no real difference, okay? But these are wise men that study the stars, and they have seen a strange sign in the stars, a star that apparently is unprecedented, And they are convinced that this star somehow represents that the expected Messiah is being born at this time. And we can stop right here for a moment. If you are talking about wise men that believe in a coming Messiah and are watching the stars to see when the coming Messiah might come, they're probably Zoroastrians. These, at the time, are basically monotheists. They do believe in this coming of the Messiah, or they're exposed to the teachings in Judaism. I should stop here and say, we always say there are three. We don't know that for sure. The reason we say that there's three magi is because they bring three gifts. They bring gold and frankincense and myrrh. And so we just assume that each one of them is carrying each one gift. But it could have been two of them, and it could have been 15 of them. We don't know. But anyway, these wise men are following the star to find where this Messiah is born, this Mashiach is born. And they are able to follow it for some distance, but stars are very, very far away from the earth, so it's not like there's this single beam of light that just comes down in this exact location. Once you get to the point to where you look like you're right under the star, you can go for miles in either direction and still look like you're right under the star, because the star's a long way away. So they get as close as they can to being like right under the star, and then they're not sure how to go further. So they go to the closest large city, which is Jerusalem. And they go to Jerusalem inquiring where the Messiah is supposed to be born, and adding the information that we've seen his star and we are coming to worship him. Well, this gets straight to King Herod here, King Herod the Great, who, as we mentioned, was installed by Rome as the king over Judea when the Romans take over. King Herod is not happy to hear this at all, but he hides his true feelings. And he calls his wise men and asks them where the Messiah is supposed to be born to help out the wise men here. And one of his wise men quotes a scripture from the book of Micah, where it says that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. And so he tells them this, and so they're going to leave to go to Bethlehem, and he tells them, when you've gone to Bethlehem and you've found the Messiah, please come back and tell me, because I want to come and worship him too. This is Herod saying this. Herod does not want to come and worship the Messiah. Herod is famous for being extremely paranoid, and he eliminates any challenge to his throne. So he obviously wants to eliminate this child. So the wise men go, and they find the baby Jesus. It says in the house. So apparently Joseph and Mary have a house in Bethlehem where they live, which makes sense. And the Magi come in there, and they offer their gifts. And when the whole thing is done, it says that an angel appears to them in a dream and tells them to go home another way. Don't go by Jerusalem, and don't go back and tell King Herod. And so they go ahead and they leave another way. Now it takes Herod a while to figure out that he has been deceived, because obviously people don't travel quickly back then. There's no cars or buses or whatever. People travel on foot, and trips that could take us a couple hours, might take them a week. And plus, Herod doesn't know how long they're staying there or whatever. So after a while, Herod realizes finally that the three wise men have betrayed him and aren't going to come back and tell him where the Messiah was born. So at this point, he's furious. And he sends out, again, we're talking about the Gospel of Matthew here, he sends out soldiers to go through all of these Judean villages all around Jerusalem, all around the Judean foothills, and to kill every male child that appears to be 2 years old or younger. Now, fortunately, Jesus doesn't die, because Joseph has a second visit from an angel in a dream that tells him to take Mary and flee, because people are coming to kill him. And so Joseph takes Mary and Jesus and goes to Egypt. And they're in Egypt for some length of time. It doesn't say how long, but they're in Egypt up until Herod dies. So the soldiers come. Jesus with his parents is gone, but the soldiers kill a multitude of young babies in the Judean foothills. And we refer to this as the slaughter of the innocents. And this is just one of the most reprehensible stories in all of the New Testament. Anyway, Herod the Great, we know from history, dies in 4 BCE. Now, it says that he's sending out the soldiers to kill all the babies that are 2 years of age and older, according to the time that the star appeared to the Magi. Now, when the star appeared to the Magi had not traveled to Judea yet. Not sure how long that trip took, okay? And, not sure how long it had been since Herod figured out that he was deceived and got the whole thing together. But to him, this seemed like the right age of child, everybody under 2, just to be safe. So let's imagine here. Let's say that the star appeared 2 years before Herod died, and the very last thing he did in his life before he died was to send out these soldiers to kill the baby. Well, that would mean Jesus was born in 6 BCE, because Herod died in 4. Now, if Jesus was only born a year before Herod died, and Herod just was being exceedingly careful, maybe he was born in 5. There's just no way he's born later than that. Actually, 7 or 8 BCE sounds a lot more likely. So this is how we realize that the date is somehow wrong. If you wanted to just pick a date that you said would be like a likely date, I'd pick probably 7 BCE, but somewhere between 8 and 5. Okay, so that's where we get this. Anyway, Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus are in Egypt until for the 3rd time an angel appears to Joseph in a dream and tells him that they are dead that sought the baby's life. Safe to go home. So Joseph and Mary come back from Egypt. Wish we knew how long it was, because if we knew how long they were in Egypt, it would be much easier to pinpoint the date of Jesus's birth. But unfortunately, Matthew doesn't tell us exactly how long they're in Egypt. But anyway, when they come back, Joseph, the father, finds out some information apparently he didn't know when he left Egypt, and that was who is taking over for Herod. And Herod has left 3 of his sons in control. In what is today Jordan and the Golan Heights, what we call the Decapolis, he's left his son Philip. In the north, in the Galilee, and we'll see this particular Herod later on in the Gospels, he leaves his son Herod Antipas. But in the area around Jerusalem in Judea, he leaves his son Herod Archelaus. And Herod Archelaus is famous for being just as intolerant and paranoid as his father, and even crazier. In fact, he only rules for about 10 years before the Romans, take him out of rule and actually install a Roman official ruling over this area of Judea that either had the title of a procurator or a prefect. And the most famous prefect we know is when we get to the crucifixion of Jesus, the prefect that is ruling over Judea at that time is, of course, called Pontius Pilate. Now, Herod Antipas, that son still rules up in the Galilee, and Herod Philip still rules in the Decapolis. So when Joseph comes back anyway, he hears that Archelaus is ruling over the area that includes Bethlehem, and he does not want to go back to Bethlehem because he thinks that Herod Archelaus might continue the campaign of his father and initiate another, slaughter of the innocents. Maybe his father has given him orders to do this. And so Joseph doesn't think it's safe. So it says that Joseph turned aside and went up into the Galilee, into the area of Nazareth, and settles there. Now, when it says he turned aside, this implies that he was going in a different direction, but he heard some news, changed his direction, and went somewhere else. By the way, this makes perfect sense. He would be going back to the place that they were from, Bethlehem, but when he found out it wasn't safe, he goes to a place where nobody in the world is going to be looking for a Davidic Messiah, which is in Nazareth, way up in Galilee. Descendants of David just don't live there. So that's how they end up in Nazareth, and he ends up growing up in Nazareth there. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but let me talk about the Gospel of Luke and the story that Luke tells here, because there's some differences. In the Gospel of Luke, and I might say this, Matthew purports to be written by someone who was an actual disciple of Jesus and knew Jesus. Luke is written by someone who never knew Jesus. In fact, Luke and another book that he writes, which is called the Acts of the Apostles, these are the only 2 books in the New Testament that are written by a Greek. And Luke is actually converted, apparently, by an apostle, a Jewish apostle called Paul, that goes and ministers to Greeks all over Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, eventually Italy, and according to some stories, Spain. But apparently Luke is a physician who is converted by Paul And we're talking, probably 16 years after the fact of Jesus' death, give or take a year. So everything he knows is from Paul, and Paul never even met Jesus. Paul is converted after the fact by a miraculous vision. So the story is that Luke apparently goes back and interviews Jesus' mother, Mary. He can't interview Joseph, Jesus' father, because Joseph is apparently dead by this time. In fact, Joseph is apparently dead during the Gospels because you never see any mention of him, although Jesus' mother, Mary, is mentioned. And Joseph could have been much, much older than Mary. As we mentioned before, talking about ancient societies, it's entirely possible Joseph could have been 45 and Mary could have been 16 when they got married. We're not told their ages, but I just want you to remember that's completely possible. So Joseph is gone long before, so Luke apparently gets his information from Mary. So we begin with the angel Gabriel coming to Mary in Nazareth and telling Mary that she is going to have this miraculous child. Now, the angel also tells her that her cousin, Elizabeth, who lives way down in Judah, whereas what we would expect for someone, that would be her cousin who'd be of the tribe of David, that she also has become pregnant in her old age, and she's really old. So this is another, Abraham and Sarah type miracle or something. And so Mary goes down to visit her, and we find out that what's happened is Elizabeth's husband is a priest named Zechariah, pertaining to the tribe of Levi. Apparently she's a woman of the tribe of Judah that has married this priest of the tribe of Levi. But Zechariah is in the temple ministering, and the angel Gabriel comes to him and tells him that he is going to have a son, that his wife Elizabeth is going to have a son in her old age, and he should name him Yochanan, which is John. And he asks the angel, he says, how can this happen? My wife's really, really old. And the angel says, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. And because you haven't believed me, he says, you're going to be silent for a season. And so when he comes out of the temple after this day, he cannot talk. He's lost the ability to talk. And this is like, this is big news. This is the scuttlebutt. And everybody's like talking about the strange mystery of how Zechariah lost his voice. Well, he gets back his voice on the day that the week that his son is born. And when they decide that they are going to name the son by one of his ancestors, at that point, he can speak again, and he says, no, his name shall be John, or his name shall be Yochanan. And of course, this just is a great story that spreads everywhere. He can finally speak again. So, interesting story. But anyway, the son John is John the Baptist, who will appear later on. Only Luke tells us that John the Baptist and Jesus are cousins. The other three Gospels do not mention it, and some of the ways they talk about the meeting of John and Jesus really don't sound much like that they're cousins. But anyway, that's the story of Luke. So back to Mary now. Now she lives in Nazareth. How the heck did she get there? How did Joseph and Mary end up in Nazareth? Because again, this is before she's ever got pregnant. Here are two people who are descendants of David, from two different families of David, who somehow both ended up in Nazareth, which is unlikely. Luke does not explain how that is, but they start there. Here's how Luke gets them to Bethlehem. Apparently, there is some kind of a census that has been decreed by a guy named Quirinius, I believe, and obviously this is going to precede some new tax or something, but they want to take a census and figure out all the different people from each tribe. So you have to go to the hometown of your tribe or your clan to be counted. So Joseph and Mary have to go back to Bethlehem in Judea. And as they're making the trip down there, Mary is very, very, very pregnant. She's in the 9th month, and as we know, you've probably heard the story, when they get into Bethlehem, she's going into labor, and they're coming into the town with no idea where they're going to stay or anything. Very different story from Matthew, of course. Anyway, when they get into town, they can't find a place to stay at the inn. Everything's booked up. And so they end up staying in an animal shelter. Now, we see a lot of nice plays where they have a nice little wooden lean-to or whatever, but this is not made out of wood in any sense. This is a cave, and the traditional cave where this happened in Bethlehem is still revered to this day. You can go and visit it if times are nice and you can go into the West Bank. There's not some tension happening between the Palestinians and the Jews at that time. But anyway, there are natural occurring caves all over the place, and a lot of animals are stored in caves. So this is where they stay. and they lay Jesus in a manger, which, by the way, is an eating trough, if you will, for the animals. Now, a little ways away, there are shepherds watching their flocks by night, it says, and the angel of the Lord appears to them and tells them that the Messiah has been born, and they should go see him. And after that, a whole bunch of angels appear, and they launch into a big song with probably 25-part harmonies. I don't know. Anyway, so they go, and they find the baby with his parents in the cave, in the animal shelter, lying in the manger, and they come and they worship him, these shepherds. Now, there's no wise men there. The wise men visit in the house. The shepherds visit in the cave, in the animal shelter. But what we've done for Christmas is we put these two stories together. So for Christmas, what we have is we have the manger with the baby in there. But then we have the wise men bowing before the manger on the one side, which never happened. Jesus wasn't in the manger when they came to visit. On the other side, we have the shepherds that were keeping watch of their flocks who are before the manger, which really did happen. And, well, if you're a regular American, you probably have Santa Claus, bowing down before the manger too, because we just love to syncretize all these sacred traditions. But anyway, this is what's called a conflation. A conflation is when you take two sacred stories that have different features and you put them together and make one story out of them. So when you see the Christmas plays in churches or whatever, this is a conflation of Luke and Matthew put together. When Jesus is a month old and it's time to offer a sacrifice, which you do when you have a firstborn son, Joseph and Mary go to Jerusalem, make the trip from Bethlehem. And when they come into the temple, interestingly enough, there's like two old prophets that one is like a widow for a long time, one's an old man, and both of them have had some kind of a vision or some understanding that the Messiah is coming, and they both see Jesus. And they both somehow understand he's the Messiah. And it's a very, very interesting conversation. Simeon first talks about how the consolation of Israel has come. And then when they meet this other woman, Anna, she says all kinds of marvelous things about Jesus, knowing that he's the Messiah. And again, this is like a baby on his 8th day. And so Mary is kind of fascinated by this. And in Luke, it says Mary kept all of these things that were told to her and held them in her heart. And after they get done offering the sacrifice, then they travel back to Nazareth, which of course is where Jesus grows up. And so they both end up with Jesus growing up in Nazareth. Now here's what's interesting, and you might already be picking this up, but if indeed there were a multitude of young children that were killed, and Joseph and Mary had to go and live in Egypt for maybe a year or two or 3 or whatever before they came back, and then were afraid of Herod's son Archelaus, to where they decided to go up to Nazareth. These are all things that are just not mentioned in Luke anywhere, and those are pretty big stories, completely left out of Luke. So again, we have these two different stories. They've been put together, they've been conflated, but what they do agree upon, again, is that Mary was impregnated miraculously by God as a virgin. Joseph knows that and takes her as his wife. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. They eventually end up living in Nazareth. Finally, in Nazareth, Jesus' father is an artisan. Now, it's often translated as carpenter. That's deceiving. The word literally means artisan, and it's not just people that work with wood. It can refer to people that work with other materials. And why this is important is because if you've ever been to Nazareth, Nazareth, the ancient city of Nazareth, is built up the side of a mount it's rock. I mean, all the agriculture is terraced. I mean, that means that you have different stair-step levels where they're growing olive trees and grapevines are the two big things. They're the two staple crops. But trees? There's no trees. I mean, if you're going to work with wood, you're going to have to import lumber from somewhere else, and that's very expensive for somebody who's making products for a small village of people, okay? And to make it worse, Jesus, who certainly is the same trade as his father, that's the way it works, also has 4 brothers who are also artisans. So here you have 6 adult artisans in a small village working with natural materials where there's no wood. They're probably stonemasons. There's plenty of stone there. And once you get past the outer layer of the stone and chip it away, it's really easy to work the stone. It's kind of like a soapstone kind of feel. So they're probably stonemasons. These four brothers that Jesus has are mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, not one of the Gospels that has a nativity story, but often thought to be the first gospel written, and his four brothers are actually named. Here's where it gets interesting. From the Protestant perspective, and apparently the perspective of the early disciples, when the four canonical gospels were first embraced, apparently Mary is supposed to be the mother of all of these boys. Later on, there is a Catholic tradition begun that Joseph has two wives. They're both named Mary. And the first Mary was the mother of Jesus, but Joseph's second wife, Mary, is the mother of the four younger sons. Jesus is the oldest, and this becomes a Catholic tradition. Why does it become a Catholic tradition? One of the reasons is that Mary ends up having some things, some teachings about her changed to make her a little bit more larger than life. For instance, when Christianity is spreading out and pagans are being converted, all of these different pagan religions, pagan just means polytheist. That's what monotheists call anyone that believes in more than one God. So pagan has very little meaning the way it's being used here. But when people are converted, they're used to praying to male and female deities. And, to give them one male and one female deity to pray to where they used to have many, well, okay, maybe they can handle that. But to say, no, there's one male deity you pray to, you can't pray to anybody female, that doesn't work for people who really feel like that for certain things, praying to a female deity is more appropriate. So what they do is they give them a female to pray to, and it's Mary. And they actually call her Theotokos, which in the Greek means mother of God. Now, to give physical birth to God in a physical form, that makes you, a lot greater than the average human, if you will. So that's her first claim to fame. Her second claim to fame is that they say that the reason that Jesus had no sin was because at the time that Mary gave birth to Jesus, she had never sinned in her life. Now, what's the earliest she gave birth to Jesus? I don't know, 16? If you believe that any human being, male, female, or otherwise, can make it 16 years into their life, never having an evil thought or never doing any kind of a selfish deed, well, you've got more faith than I do. But anyway, that's the second thing, is that she is somehow sinless when Jesus is born. Okay? The third thing is that she remains a perpetual virgin. She never has sex for her whole life, which means she stays undefiled. So here you have the mother of God, who is sinless, who has never had sex, virgin her whole life, and the last thing they add is the idea that she never even died, that she was bodily assimilated, raised up into heaven. Now, all of this is much, 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 much later, by the way. Nobody thought this, in the first couple generations. In fact, we have a tomb of Mary that you can see in Jerusalem, and is extremely close to the grotto where we have Gethsemane, the oil press with the garden outside of it. I mean, you can walk from one to the other in like a minute. Very close. And so the same, Mary, who rose to heaven and never physically died, has a grave that people visit. Welcome to religion, okay? Tradition, pilgrimage places, it's crazy stuff. So this is how everything changes. So let me finish Catholicism and then I will go back. So if you're a Catholic and you're looking at the story, first of all, what would all the people in Nazareth think? They would think that Joseph had two wives, and so that Jesus and his brothers were half brothers. By the way, he's got at least two sisters too, because Mark talks about his sisters, doesn't tell us how many, but it's plural, so it's at least two. But he's got these four brothers who are, according to the Catholic tradition, the people in Nazareth would have thought they were half brothers, but if you're a believer, that's not true. Because they would only be half-brothers from sharing the same father. But you know that Joseph is not Jesus' father. So they're not really half-brothers, right? They're step-brothers. That's the Catholic tradition. But the earliest accounts don't seem to go along with this. Going back to the Gospels, it says, when it talks about Joseph and his wife and their sexual relationship, it says that when Mary is found to be pregnant with Jesus, Joseph marries her, but he does not have sex with her. He doesn't consummate the marriage, or know his wife is the euphemism, until after she brings forth her firstborn son. Now, just in this one verse, you've got two things that are clear. Number one, of course, Jesus is her firstborn son. Now, why in the world would you have to say that he's your firstborn son if he's her only son? Okay, I've got one daughter. I have never yet introduced her as, oh, this is my oldest daughter. Why would I say that? I don't have a younger one. I would just say this is my daughter. So when he says her firstborn son, that implies there's others. And the other is clearly he had no sex with his wife until she brought forth her firstborn son. When you say that something didn't happen until a certain time, it means that it did happen at that certain time. So the Protestant tradition, which Martin Luther kind of takes and goes back to the earliest tradition, doesn't accept the later interpretations of the Catholic Church. According to this, Mary is the mother of all of the brothers, which makes sense because in the Gospels she comes to see Jesus a couple times with his brothers. No mention of their mother coming with them or anything like that. And again, the one scripture saying that apparently Joseph did have sex with his wife after Jesus was born, and Jesus was her firstborn son. So, according to this, the people in Nazareth, let's go back to Nazareth now, the people in Nazareth would assume, since Joseph has one wife, that Jesus and his four brothers are full brothers, right? But as a believer, you would know, because Jesus' father is not Joseph. So what are they? They're actually half-brothers because they share the same mother, but not the same father. And these are the differences between the Protestant and the Catholic idea. So anyway, when Jesus is of age and it is time to start his ministry, he actually moves from Nazareth, again, this village built up the side of a rocky hillside, where probably he and his brothers, they probably work with wood too, but probably very little. They probably work a lot more with stone. When he leaves to start his ministry, he leaves Nazareth and he relocates to a town called Capernaum, or Capernaum, which means the village of Nahum. In the Old Testament, if you're a Christian or the Hebrew Bible, it's your prophet name. We say Nahum, but it's actually Nahum. And so Capernaum means the village of Nahum, of Nahum. So that's what Capernaum means. And most people, I guess, say Capernaum, but it's Capernaum. So he moves to this town, a little bit bigger than Nazareth, but still not very big. But this is different. It's down much lower on the side of the Sea of Galilee. And it's a fishing town. And in fact, the disciples that he ends up living with are fishermen. Peter and Andrew are disciples that live together with their families and extended families. They're brothers. They share the same insula and they have a fishing business. And there are also two other brothers, James and John, part of his disciples, who have a fishing business with their father, Zebedee. And so these four fishermen live in Capernaum, and Jesus calls 12 disciples, but these are the four fishermen that we hear the most about. Of the 12 disciples, there's three that are kind of the inner three, as you'll find out. Peter, one of the brothers, Peter and Andrew, and the two brothers, James and John. Peter, James, and John, they kind of end up being like the inner three, if you will. But Andrew is one of the 12 disciples as well. And there's a number of different disciples that are called from different areas. And so Capernaum is where most of this ministry takes place. And Jesus actually lives with Peter and Andrew and their extended families there. In fact, you can see the archaeological remains of the house that Jesus lived in with Peter and Andrew. And the reason this is one of those sites you can be a little bit more sure is the real site is because the home continued to be venerated for centuries after Jesus's life. This is pretty well established as a fascinating place to visit. If you ever go to Israel, be sure to go to Capernaum. By the way, 2 insula over is the synagogue in Capernaum, which, as you're going to hear in our later videos, Jesus gets to an awful lot of trouble by doing miracles in the midst of the synagogue services, and we'll talk about why that causes a ruckus. But a lot of miracles are done in and around Capernaum. But Jesus travels all over the place. He travels all over the Galilee, even out of the country a couple times, goes to Jerusalem frequently for the different religious festivals, but home base is the home of Peter and Andrew in Capernaum. So in our next video, we're going to start talking about the miracles of Jesus, and after that, the major teachings of Jesus, and we're going to pick up in Capernaum here. And we're going to talk a little bit about John the Baptist and who he is at the beginning of the next video as well. So I will see you then.